Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to the DM Roundtable for August 2021. This is a chance for patrons and I to get together and discuss topics in tabletop RPGs. By sharing ideas, thoughts, and experiences, we can all become better DMs or GMs. The DM Roundtable discussions are open to all patrons at every level of patreon.com/RogueWatson. You don't even have to be an active participant. You can jump in here and lurk to your heart's content, and we are glad to have you. This month's topic, as determined by the Patreon poll, was a tie, but there was a bit more interest in Exhaustion, so I went with that. Exhaustion is a potentially lethal series of debuffs that can last a long time. Do we utilize Exhaustion in our games, and how do we balance it along with everything else? Joining me for this month's DM Roundtable, we have the Fireworks Factory.
Hello.
Farty McButterpants.
Hello.
And Jordan.
Hello, guys.
So, I don't know if Exhaustion is a completely new mechanic to 5th edition. I never played 4th. It feels like it's kind of a newish mechanic. And it's really unique in how it operates and how it works and how some things care about Exhaustion and most things comfortably ignore it. It's a very unique condition. So just to go over it briefly, because that's going to be our main topic, it has 6 different levels, and you can you inflict exhaustion upon, technically I guess you can inflict it on enemies too. It is just a debuff that works for everybody, but usually on players. And when they're suffering a level of exhaustion, they're all cumulative, so you just start stacking all these horrible debuffs. Level 1 is disadvantage on all ability checks. Level 2, your speed is halved. At level 3 of disadvantage on attack rolls and saving throws, now it starts getting real fucking bad. Level 4, your hit point maximum is halved. Level 5, your speed is reduced to 0, and level 6, you just die. The only way to heal exhaustion is every time you long rest, you reduce it by 1. So if you're suffering multiple levels of exhaustion, then you're still suffering some levels of exhaustion after a long rest, which is pretty crazy. You can also get healed with a Greater Restoration spell. However, that is a 5th level spell, and it costs 100 gold pieces because you have to spend a gem of some sort that costs 100 gold pieces. So it's kind of a brutal effect. And that's how I'm going to open the floor by saying who uses Exhaustion or doesn't use Exhaustion because of its balance. Jordan, let's start with you.
I think exhaustion makes sense. I like using it. However, with it, there's different homebrews that I've read up online, different things that I've seen. I'm going to do a quick shout out to the Dungeon Coach, because he made some good consolidation of a variety of those variant methods. But in general, I think it's interesting. I don't think at the very beginning with first and second level, second level more so, but first level, it doesn't affect combat at all. So if you have something that happens in the middle of combat and they gain exhaustion, whip-de-freaking do. The only thing it's going to affect is if they want to do an athletics check, but outside of that, it doesn't do anything.
Right, it'd be like a contested, checks. Like a grapple or... Maybe if you counterspelled and you had to make like a check for a higher level counterspell, would that count? I'm trying to think of some like edge cases for when you use ability checks in combat.
Yeah, that would be one. But with the exception of those, even when you look at how they're listed, for the most part, it doesn't even really affect spellcasters without the exception of the counterspell.
Yeah.
So even the only time it really starts hitting them is at level 3, and that's with concentration saving throws. But for the most part, like, the only thing it really affects is melee combatants. And so that's why I tend to drift more toward variant options.
So you think exhaustion isn't debilitating enough?
Oh, for heaven's sakes, no, it's not. Like, the only time it gets bad is once you hit level 5 and level 6. And at that point in time, if you haven't been resting for 5 days, you should be dead.
Right.
So I don't think it's debilitating enough, and there's very few times where you can actually gain exhaustion. except for like typically like travel and those types of things. I can't think of many creatures that will do something and then you gain exhaustion.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. It's not a very common. It really seems to be up to the DM, and it's usually used as like an environmental, like you fail to save for, you know, traversing through a swamp or fording a river or surviving the elements or something. Farty, you use exhaustion in your games?
I haven't used it a lot before. I have started using it in Rime of the Frostmaiden. I don't want to get into spoilers, but I have been using it there because.
But it's cold up there.
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at
Dale.
exhaustion, you're going to have its lack of food, lack of water, lack of sleep. I don't track food or water in my games, so that's out. There's extreme exposure to extreme heat or extreme cold, so it fits really well.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also, you could do hard adventuring over a long time period. You can bring it in that way. With Rime of the Frostmaiden, the extreme cold, I totally grasped onto that, and I said, okay, I've got to bring in exhaustion because I think it's a cool thing to use. I've only really used it a couple of times, and we've never really gotten past level 2. So the level 2 was pretty tough because the guy all of a sudden was half speed, and he was a dwarf, and we were climbing Calvin's Cairn. He got caught in um, the avalanche, and yeah, it beat him up a little. And then you got the Yetis, and that was touch and go.
Yeah, that's a big reason why I wanted to talk about exhaustion was because of Rime of the Frostmaiden is the first one that really made me go, okay, this is literally a classic like extreme environment, man versus nature situation that just happens to have a D&D adventure set here. So you've got to include like some kind of reflection of that, and it seems like the exhaustion system is designed exactly for that. Hopefully. Fireworks Factory, do you use exhaustion in your games?
I have yet to use exhaustion in my campaign. I've experienced it once in a different campaign. In that situation, the party only got up to level 1, and so those penalties were pretty interesting. It didn't really have too much of an impact to the game overall. But using it in my campaigns, I haven't really thought about it. I guess right now it's sort of up there on the same level as like including encumbrance or keeping track of making sure the party is consuming food rations whenever they take a long rest or something along those lines. So
you consider it too fiddly, too much bookkeeping?
Yes, I would.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree, especially after using it a little bit in this campaign. My group in particular, for anybody that watches us, know that we forget our shit all the time, and I am not immune to that. As a DM, I forget, creature abilities and things frequently. And I think because exhaustion isn't integrated into the character sheet in a very meaningful way, it's just like an additional, it's a stacking debuff you have to keep track of. I don't know, it's just easy for like everybody, DMs included, to just completely forget about it. And so I agree, it tends to be, that tends to be going to the realm of like fiddly stuff that I don't want to track, which is stuff like encumbrance and food and water and just crap that I don't really care about because we're running kind of a, action movie series here, not necessarily and maybe that's the problem. We're not running a survival RPG or horror thing where people are trying to keep track of like all their ammunition and all their food rations and things, which maybe exhaustion would be a better fit for that style campaign.
Quick plug for Fantasy Grounds: it automates remembering it and the effects. Okay, I'm done.
Ooh, yeah, that would probably help. I need to get a Roll20 mod for that. I want to also get one to plug in because we do use lingering injuries, and I feel like our lingering injuries kind of fill the same void. Well,
Yeah.
void, not the right word, but the same purpose of exhaustion, which is you've got this debilitating effect that's punishing you for a lengthy amount of time that's longer than, you know, potentially, and really with lingering injuries, it could even last beyond a long rest because you have like one chance to heal it every time if you don't want to go pony up the cash to get it healed. And we have a trouble remembering our long rest a lot of times. Like we'll forget that shit all the time. So let alone trying to come up with, trying to remember exhaustion effects.
One of the other things as a plug for Rhyme, I've used it in that current campaign when people fell through ice in the frozen areas. So if the one scenario that you've already alluded to or mentioned before with the dwarves and the stuff on the cairn, there's one. Falling through the ice is another. But it definitely, I wish it wasn't limited to strictly whatchamacallit, environmental and taking care of your necessities. Like the closest that you actually have in terms of magic causing exhaustion is the slow spell. And those effects in there definitely create situations that you can kind of pull from if you were to use variant options. Because those variant ones that I was alluding to, like one of the ones that you can use is for each level, regardless of what everything else says, you just do a -1 per level of exhaustion to your attacks, saves, skills, spell save DCs, just -1 across the board. And you also lose 5 feet of movement. And that's for each level of exhaustion.
Is that the way, dungeon coach did that? Was that the...
That's one of them. Yeah. That one's just a simple way where you don't have to sit there and fiddle around and go, okay, well, which one was which and why am I half speed and I'm not dead, but now I can't move at all?
Maybe, but I feel like a lot of modifiers is going against of what makes 5e an attractive system, which is it doesn't have a lot of those like ongoing modifiers. It uses like mostly purely like the advantage disadvantage system. Like very rare, I think only cover that I can think of like is a straight up like this is +2 or +3 to something, which is why a lot of people 5e works very elegantly that way compared to something like Pathfinder, which I think Pathfinder is a great game, but it definitely has that like, okay, I've got a +2 from this, a +3 from that, a +4 for this, a -1 for that. You got to do a little math thing in there, which you know that's still a great game and a good system, but I think I'm always leery, and I review a lot of class supplement products, but I'm very leery when I see effects and things that specifically do the modifier things. I'm like, this doesn't really feel like 5e to me at that point. And I don't know if a bunch of -1s would help solve that issue. I'll tell you what. So I agree that it's a shame that exhaustion, if they're going to have exhaustion be a thing, it's a shame that it's not really integrated into monster stat blocks. And if people were getting exhaustion more often, I think it would be a thing we would all remember more. If there were more enemies, like in the older editions of D&D, there were enemies that could like level drain you and reduce your max hit point. I think there's still enemies that can reduce your max hit points, but if those kind of enemies inflicted exhaustion effects on you, then
like
suddenly...
when a banshee yells at you and it takes off years off your life, but you don't get exhaustion.
Just manifest that as levels of exhaustion. Then suddenly those enemies become very unique because it's almost like Darkest Dungeon, those kind of games where you have a hit point bar and a sanity bar. It's almost like exhaustion could be your sanity bar in a way. I mean, it's like your stamina bar, I guess technically, but because it has a meter that goes up to death, which is how those RPGs work, where you've got your physical hit points and your mental hit points. In this case, your exhaustion is a different kind of physical hit points, I guess. But it'd be interesting if there were some enemies that specifically attacked that part of your hit point bar, which was represented by exhaustion. So if you fought enemies that specifically just debuffed you to exhaustion. Now, the problem with that is the game isn't balanced necessarily for that, because you only reduce exhaustion levels by 1 per long rest. And the way
the other way that you can do it outside of the Greater Restoration is you can have potions of vitality. So there are spells that you can do to use it. There's the resting that you can do to use it, and then there's actual items that you can do to use it.
That's true.
So if you were to adjust the game to add more exhaustion, I agree where your premise, where you're heading, where you would have to increase new ways to also remove it. If you're going to debuff it, you also have to buff it in another way to keep it balanced.
Yeah.
So maybe instead of having the paladins 5 points of lay on hands gets rid of curses, maybe it also removes a level of exhaustion.
Yeah, it would have to be opened up a lot more. The way it's written right now, it just feels like such a tangential system that only comes up in these certain environmental conditions. I've never, I don't think, ever had anybody go above 1 level of exhaustion. I don't think it's ever come up yet. And we really only have used exhaustion, to my knowledge, in this campaign. I think we may have used it before earlier, but it must have been so rare I don't remember. But this campaign has been a couple times, which has been pretty low, like con saving throws, and even then, and I have like gate set up, which is basically like if you're in a tricky environment, which is Icewind Dale during the rhyme, and I allow a survival check to try to make it to your destination without fucking around, without getting lost, spending too much time. If the person fails that survival check, then everybody in the party has to make a con saving throw. Not very high. It's like a DC 10 or something. And then if you fail that save, then you get inflicted with exhaustion. I don't know if that's a great system or not, or even a good one, but it's the way that I'm trying to just elegantly create the feel of, okay, I'm not going to keep track of your rations, I'm not going to keep track of all this bullshit, but I do want to have some kind of feeling of this is a harsh environment, and there should be some kind of penalties. But I don't necessarily want to just say, okay, well, getting from A to B, you guys instantly all suffer 2 levels of exhaustion because it's just that hard outside. Like, that feels too punitive, and especially because there's just not good ways of curing exhaustion either.
Your method sounds a lot like Oregon Trail. Sorry, but Susie just contracted dysentery.
Yeah. Straight up.
But yeah, no, it makes sense. Like, I think it's underutilized. I don't think it's as fleshed out as other aspects of the game, for sure. And so because of that, it's kind of like, it's almost like alignment. It's like, okay, cool, this thing exists, but you're only going to use it once every 5 years of playing the game. So congratulations, this is your one chance to use it. So roll with it.
You know what?
Yeah, but is it underutilized because, if you think about it, most exhaustion is going to come from almost like the hex crawl portion of your travel. You're going from one place, and a lot of people just hand wave that, especially, we've talked about it before.
Yeah.
So you almost have to homebrew something. I'm not so worried about the exhaustion levels, like, what's level 1, what's level 2. I think they're fine. I mean, my challenge is, how do I bring it into the game? How do I, do I have to disrupt their sleep? I have to hit them with some kind of, snowstorm or blizzard or something on their travel. They got to roll for con saves or something. And if you look at the way it is in the notes, if you're, if it's really cold, I think you have to roll a con save every hour.
Jeez.
I don't even track time in my games. So what is?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, do I all of a sudden start tracking every hour and say, okay, roll another con save? So it's the tough part, is finding out how the hell do I bring it into this game?
Yeah, it is the exploration section of D&D is definitely the weakest. Like, role playing is still very much up to the DMs and players to buy in, but it's always been a pretty easy thing to create, I think. Combat is thoroughly supported by every system in the game. But the exploration part, the traveling part, has always been very tricky, and we might get a little off topic with talking about travel specifically, but because exhaustion is mostly tied to travel, I think that's a good point, that it suffers from the same part, that we don't have good firm rules on traversing through areas. Now that I think about it, the one time I remember exhaustion, it was at the, slight spoilers for Tomb of Annihilation, The boss fight of Tomb of Annihilation, again, mute me if you don't want to be spoiled on that, was against a creature that has, I believe, legendary actions of being able to cause force saves against exhaustion, which seemed really deadly on paper, but I don't remember amounted to much in my game. Maybe everybody just rolled really well on their saves. I don't remember, but that's where I remember it from. Here's a point I want to bring up. Why not just use hit dice? If exhaustion is meant to simulate stamina, your overall ability to recuperate over time, D&D 5th edition already has a great system for that, and it's called hit dice, which is the players using a resource that they have to heal themselves on short rests. So what if instead of inflicting exhaustion, you just took away some hit dice? That's something that I've been thinking about because I've reviewed several products that have done a really interesting job of making it that if you failed certain saves or took too long doing certain checks, that they would, instead of, and it wasn't something that would necessarily do damage to you, but you wanted to fail forward, it'd be like, okay, well, you successfully, push this, door, this heavy door up so you can get through, but you lose like 2 of your hit dice. As if you had short rested, but obviously you don't get the hit points for that. And I thought that was a really interesting system because that's something that obviously players are already keeping track of. And assuming you've, it only really works obviously if you're in the middle of a dungeon crawl or if you're doing some other, long rest, you don't get to heal all your things kind of rules that I do. But it's less debilitating and less punitive and less bookkeeping than exhaustion. And yet it is still painful because people don't get to use their hit dice. Now that does maybe penalize the marshals up front rather than the casters, but it just an idea was, I thought that was an interesting concept from different products I'd read where they used losing hit dice as in place of inflicting exhaustion. Anybody have any thoughts about that?
I think that sounds like it has potential to factor in exhaustion in games, because you're right. There's not a whole lot of ways other than environment for the environment to penalize players in terms of exhaustion. But I think trying it out with hit dice would be a very interesting thing to see.
So if we're gonna go through that real quick, let's run that thought process out. So if you're doing a level of exhaustion, do you ever have situations where you, like in Rime, when my players went under the water into the ice, I ended up hitting the player that went under the water, I think with 2 or 3 levels of exhaustion because they were under there so long.
Do you give them a save for that, or you just straight up do it?
I gave them a save, but it got harder the longer they were in there. So I increased the DC the longer they were in there.
Okay.
But the idea of expending hit dice is even on a long rest, you only get half of them back.
Yes.
So if you're in a dungeon, or we'll say in this situation, you're out in the middle of the icy tundra, you get caught in a blizzard, you get hit for that. In the blizzard, maybe you get attacked by a Yeti because you happen to be on top of a hill. At the end of that fight, when you go back and you're sitting there going, okay, we need to rest, we need to get our hit points back, your level doing that particular thing could have been anywhere from level 1 to level 4. If you got hit with exhaustion, that just cost you anywhere from 6, potentially anywhere from, we'll say 6, including con modifier, to 13 hit points, depending on whether you were front line or back line. And on top of that, you are going to spend some more, but even after the long rest, when you eventually get that, you're still going to be feeling the effects of that 2 or 3 days later, because you might not got all your hit points back, and you might have been killed in the process. So it's compelling.
I always thought that was a weird rule.
Compelling.
Yeah,
It's punishing. It's
it-
very, very punishing.
It is. The fact
It's
that the one thing you don't fully recover in a long rest is your hit dice. You only recover half.
That I could spin off into a whole nother roundtable because I actually did a Monster Hunter 5e campaign that I was trying to run for a couple of weeks, and there wasn't enough interest in it, so it kind of fell off. But we were using some of the variant healing options in the DMG, and there's others where you, on a short rest, you do get all your hit points back, all your hit dice. So depending on what rule set you're using for hit dice, if you're using standard, this different way of doing exhaustion would be very easy to track, especially on Roll20, and very punishing. So in your scenario, it might work really, really well. And because you're doing your own homebrew rules, by all means, throw it in there. I can't wait to see what your group does.
Well, I'm not completely sold on it. It's still in the theory crafting stage, but it would solve. I will say that it would solve the issue of here's another thing we have to keep track of because everybody is already keeping track of their hit dice. Like that's just a resource that you're using, you're spending, and it's pretty easy to say, okay, you failed this con save. Now you have to deduct 2 dice from your hit dice pool. Like that's you don't have to keep track of it from then on. It's just done. Versus exhaustion, which is something like, okay, now I've got this, ongoing debuff that I have to constantly remember, like what it does to me every time.
So here's a different question: if you run out of hit dice, similar to exhaustion with enough levels, if you have no hit dice left and you take another level of exhaustion, do you just straight die? Similar to 6 levels of regular exhaustion using the hit dice method?
I think using the hit dice method, you would have to start inflicting actual exhaustion at that point. And you'd have to come up with some system of like, do you just start at level 1 or do you just jump ahead? Or how that works, because I don't think it's fair to just start knocking people unconscious or anything that's said, but maybe it is. I don't know. It depends on the kind of game you're running too.
Because the way that the system currently is built is it affects you socially, because that's usually where you're using your ability checks.
Yeah.
Then it affects your actual movement. Then it affects you in combat, and then you straight up at level 4.
Stealth is another one you use in combat if you're a rogue.
That's true. That's true. Very true. Very true. What's level 4 again?
4 is hit point maximum halved. Yeah.
Got it.
Which, man, what a pain in the ass to keep track of. Like, I hate all the hit point reduction ones.
That one, the variant rule that the dungeon coach came up with is they said you just gain vulnerability.
Yeah, I remember that. I liked that better. That was good. That's an easy. Yeah, just everything does double damage to you. Yeah, I don't want to fucking put everybody's hit point.
Remember what your hit points were?
Yeah, that's a nightmare.
So yeah, no, the only reason why I would not technically try the hit dice one, even though it is compelling, is that reason where it affects all those other aspects of the game. Where if you just did hit dice, yeah, it's easy to track, but it doesn't affect the role play outside of you just having to be more careful with taking damage because you're not going to heal as much.
Yeah.
I would suggest getting to using the hit dice. The hit dice theory is that once you reach that maximum level of exhaustion and all of your hit die are gone, you would make the character roll for hit dice, but the amount that they roll subtracts from their current hit points. So now they're rolling hit dice to affect them negatively, rather than just killing them outright. They're slowly dying.
Like you literally roll the hit dice as if you were healing from a short rest, and then it just subtracts their hit points?
Exactly.
Okay.
The Bizarro hit dice, I believe it is referred to.
So if we're going to do that on not just a small itsy bitsy level 5 character, but now you're far enough in the campaign that you're level 8, you're going to have to be 12 levels of exhaustion in before it's actually going to even mean anything to you. Because you're going to need to get rid of all those hit dice before it's actually doing any damage to you. And then when you rest, you're not going to get healed at all.
My main worry is that that system would be the hit dice system would be too geared towards punishing the martial classes that rely specifically more on their hit points. Because how often are spellcasters necessarily rolling their hit dice during a short rest? Versus, obviously your tanks, your frontliners, those are the ones that are going to be critically worried about their hit dice pool and using those hit dice. So with the hit dice system, you inflict that upon the party, and the bummer is I think it's going to affect, some classes and some archetypes more than others just because they rely on their hit points more often.
And I think it negatively or what's the opposite of exponential? it affects the lower classes, lower level characters a lot more than it would ever affect the higher level classes. Meanwhile, if you're...
To be fair, higher level is just awful to try and inflict anyway.
Now that you've gotten Chris's game,
yeah, high level D&D is that. You know what? That's a great DM roundtable right there. It's just high level D&D is insane and frankly not balanced at all. which guess what? Why do you think all the official 5e campaigns are like 1 to 12? Because even Wizards is like throwing up their hands, going, "Fuck it, we're not trying to go anywhere above like level 12 or 13 because it's just nuts."
Every round is a counterspell.
Oh my goodness. Here's a fun question. Has anybody seen or utilized in their games the Path of the Berserker Barbarian? This is there were only, I believe, 2 barbarian subclasses in the original player's handbook, and that is one of them, and kind of almost looks like kind of the default choice for barbarians. And the reason I bring that up is because it is universally reviled because of its signature ability, which is Frenzy. At 3rd level, when you rage, you go into a Frenzy, which means you can essentially use a bonus attack, a bonus action as an additional attack, which sounds amazing, but then when your rage ends, you suffer a level of exhaustion. Now, to my knowledge, I have not combed through everything. I don't believe there's any other class that inflicts exhaustion on you for using its signature ability. And for that reason, everybody's like, this is the worst fucking subclass in the game. And it's not, it's a good ability, but it's not that good where you should have to give literally exhaustion every time. It's very poorly balanced. I think that's a no. Nobody's seen this class used in the wild. I don't think anybody uses it for that reason.
Well, I didn't use the Barbarian, but I did have a Goliath in a campaign, and I can't remember what he used, but he would almost like the same thing. He would go put on extra damage or get advantage on his rolls, but then he would gain the level of exhaustion. And I think he got to 2-3 levels of exhaustion.
Jeez.
It was pretty damning, yeah.
Yeah, it's awful. Like, there's not. I would immediately if somebody wanted to play this class, I would immediately rebalance it, homebrew it, and say, okay, at the very least, you can do this once and not ever suffer exhaustion. And then maybe if you want to try to pull it again, which, it's tied to your rage. Like, that's something barbarians are going to fucking do all the time. At the very least, I would say you can, once per day, you can frenzy without any consequence. And then if you do it again, you suffer exhaustion. Or make it a save and be like, all right, you can make a save for a thing. Or make it like, okay, if you go frenzy, but you don't do enough damage, or like some kind of thing where the player can feel like it's a risk reward they can overcome, and not just, hey, you turn this on and you will suffer this horribly damning effect that is just, it feels like this was designed so early in D&D before they were finished designing like exhaustion and how like A, punitive it was, and B, how not easy it is to get rid of. Like, can you imagine like frenzying 2 or 3 times a day as a barbarian, getting exhaustion every time, and then you get your long rest and it only reduces by 1? You're like, well, fuck me, I guess I'm not like raging this next day, which is my whole thing. I just want to go on a rant about that because this is the exhaustion topic, and I thought that the Path of the Berserker is bullshit. And nobody should be forced to inflict exhaustion upon themselves. That's awful. And it's too bad because, like, looking at the class, like, the other abilities are cool. Like, it basically is like, it's kind of like the champion fighter, where it's just like the default, like, hey, if you just like being a barbarian and raging, then go for this. You don't have any other fancy abilities. You can just do your thing. But unfortunately, your thing is that you now inflict exhaustion on yourself whenever you use your signature ability, which is just, it's the worst. The worst possible thing.
I was thinking of specific words that involve an animal and something that comes out of them. But yes, no, I completely agree. It's something that having it be such a rare condition and then having that occur with it, it's damning. Yeah, it's just not. It's not good.
It literally feels like a beta level class that should not have been finalized after they figured out what exhaustion was. And yeah, frankly, I'm not terribly satisfied with the way the exhaustion system works. I think it's okay, but it also is just another thing that players and DMs have to keep track of. And it's not fully supported in the rules and through like monster stat blocks. I feel like if it was more utilized, there were more monsters that could deal the exhaustion track, or more like failing forward. Exhaustion could be a good way of failing forward, which is like if you want somebody's jumping across a chasm and they roll a check and they fail it, but they don't like abysmally fail it, and you don't necessarily want that player to fall down into their plummet to their death, you can say, okay, well, you make the jump, but you fucking sprained, your ankle on the landing. You fall. It takes a lot out of you, and I want to inflict something upon you that would, reflect that, and that's kind of where exhaustion could potentially come into play. If it had more, systems like that, and more effects supported by the game, I think exhaustion would be better utilized and more recognizable for the players and the DMs.
What about this? What if you used it as a player's choice for self-imposed and inspiration? They absolutely screwed a roll. They want to re-roll it. They don't have inspiration. Okay, I'm going to take a level of exhaustion and re-roll and get a mulligan.
Yeah, that's not a bad idea. I feel like that
because it's their choice. It's not you imposing it. It's just, hey, do you want to do it?
I feel like a better system for that would be as if this were a literal superhero RPG. If this were a superhero RPG, I feel like an exhaustion system where you would specifically choose to like drain yourself physically in order to really, quote unquote, dig deep and go Super Saiyan mode and beat the villain or something. That would be very well supported and be very thematic. You could do that in D&D for sure, and we kind of run those kind of games anyway. My games are. But I don't know if the trade-off would be worth it quite there. But that would be interesting if you gave players that option. It's like, hey, you can choose to inflict exhaustion upon yourself. A lot of them would probably take it in the middle of combat because for the reasons we stated, unless you are stealthing as a rogue or counterspelling or you're the face and you need to make, you're constantly trying to talk people down in the middle of combat, more than likely that first level exhaustion isn't going to affect your combat encounter. Now, the thing is, are you going to long rest after that encounter? Or, and cure that, or is that going to be for the whole dungeon? It's like, well, you still might want to take ability checks at some point during that dungeon.
But at the same point in time with rogues, with their ability checks, they have that thing in their kit where if they absolutely suck at their role, they can do, I can't remember what it was, but I think it's like you get like 10 instead of your roll. If you roll less than a 10, then you automatically get 10.
Is that base level rogues or is that certain subclasses?
No. That's a certain level. It's base level.
Base level rogues.
It's I need to grab the player's handbook.
Yeah, but I know what you're talking about. And Chris has that with the bard equivalent of that, where like he can't roll worse than a 10 on certain like speech charisma checks. So that is certainly and that's an interesting way to not necessarily make yourself immune to disadvantage, but certainly makes it so you can't like royally fuck things up. And if your modifier is good enough, then it's almost like not having disadvantage. If you've got like a +6, like, oh, I can't roll worse than a 16 on this check.
Right. It's called Reliable Talent.
Okay.
It's at 11th level.
I'm sure a lot of people watching this were shouting, "Reliable Talent, you idiot!" Like, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I was on mute, guys. I was shouting it, so I was on mute.
Nice. All right. Let's go over our final thoughts for Exhaustion. Mr. Mute Fireworks Factory, let's hear from you first.
Oh, okay. I would probably eventually use it in future campaigns. I would try to find a way to really tie it in with uh, consuming rations and uh, um, so a way that the party will need to place an importance on uh, you know bringing along a certain amount of rations so that way they don't get exhausted for the campaign. But other than that, I probably won't use it in future campaigns.
Fair. Mr. Farty, tell me about your final thoughts on Exhaustion.
Yeah. So the one thing, like, I know I won't track food and water. That's not mine. But there are places I think I can use it. Um, so for me, looking at how do I inflict it, you know, um, if they're out on the tundra, I hit them with a blizzard. There's got to be some kind of check there to make sure. Do they get split up? You know, do they have to? If it's 4 hour blizzard, how do they protect themselves in the cold? Do I give them a couple of checks there? Is there something that happens overnight? I usually run 3 checks through the night to see if there's a random encounter. So I don't know if I haven't really done this before. I've given them a long rest, but should I take the long rest out if they have a fight? And now there's a level of exhaustion. So there's trying to find ways to kind of bring it into the game, but I think in a way you have to homebrew some pieces. Going back to Charling mentioned Dungeon Coach. He had a piece that I got early on, which was about frost checks, which I thought was cool because as I was reading through the campaign, one thing I realized was if you have cold weather clothing, you're resistant to you know um, cold exposure, and they all get cold weather clothing at the beginning of the
Right.
campaign. So I'm
Yeah.
like, okay, well, that eliminates that whole thing.
Here's
So
the
I'm like,
problem. It's fixed. So ignore paragraph 2.
Yeah, that
yeah,
is a weird
just
part of
ignore it.
that.
So what I did was I did the frost check piece where it was like you got a little bit of a buff with every piece you added. If you got a ring of warmth, that was only a +5 to your frost check. It wasn't a resistance. So that helped kind of keep it around a little longer. But I think whatever you do, you have to homebrew some.
Yeah. Yeah. Jordan, final thoughts on Exhaustion.
I like it. It requires homebrew. So they designed it as well as they did to put out the product when they did, but as things have evolved in the game, it needs revisiting just as much as they needed to revisit the Ranger. So there's just aspects of the game that are so old that they need to put out 6E. And when they do, this will be one of those points that they'll have to hit. But outside of that, yes, I like using it. I don't have enough opportunities to use it. As you mentioned, Tomb of Annihilation has it. Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frost Maiden obviously has it. You'd even be surprised that Dragon Heist has it in one particular location of the map. So they write it in certain environmental places. So as a DM, if you want to use it, you have to legitimately look at the environment, not just as a grid map, not just as something that you have to go find, but it has to be an active element of role play, of combat. You have to really think of that as not just exploration as the third tier of adventuring, but the environment as a third NPC in every encounter. Social, exploration, and combat. And if that's not an aspect of it, then Exhaustion just serves no real point in the game.
That's a good point. Yeah, I think it's important to have a system that penalizes the players that isn't just hit points, that represents their overall like stamina or mental state or something. Exhaustion was clearly meant to be that system, but it's just not fully supported like it should have been. It should have been more utilized. It should be a part of a lot of monster stat blocks. It should have been a bigger part of, put it alongside hit points and be like, all right, I'm currently on, level 0, or do the opposite. Make it like, you've got a pool of 10 exhaustion and you lose exhaustion, for different penalties. And then if you ever reach, 0, you're fucking dead. You can do the same thing and just kind of rejigger it a little bit. I like the system of RPGs. There's a lot of horror RPGs that do this, is having the physical hit point bar and the mental sanity bar. In this case, D&D isn't that kind of game, but you could still do it with your overall stamina, which represented by just feats. The environment is slowing you down and damaging you, or different monsters are doing that kind of effect on you where it's just weakening you versus necessarily dealing actual damage. So I wish those systems were more interesting and better integrated into the game, because I feel like if it came up more often, if it was used more often and players interacted with it more often, and there were more spells and tools for reducing it and monsters were inflicting it more often, then it wouldn't feel like this kind of weird superfluous extra debuff that we're all having to keep track of and all forgetting about, which I think is the problem it is now. So we either need to change it into something else, like just affecting hit dice, or just saying, okay, you got disadvantage on stuff, or just something easier, or go the other way and make it a more interesting system and have it be more supported by the other aspects of the game rather than just purely environmental. All right, that is my thoughts on Exhaustion. Those are all of our thoughts on Exhaustion. So I think that will do it for this DM Roundtable. Thank you to Fireworks Factory, Farty McButterpants, and Jordan for joining me for this month's DM Roundtable. Thank you to all my wonderful patrons. Shoutouts to Platinum patrons: Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Wizard Princess, Christopher Thomas, Captain Mike, Adam, Aiden, Stan, Nathan, Alex, Chad, Alexander, Dan, Daniel, and Cam. And gold patrons: RPG Papercrafts, Charming Grenade, Pretty Boy, and Yuma, Dead Lizard Lounge, Sam, Arash, Lumpy Spuds, Jerome, Scalenia, Nick, Farty McButterpants, Blood Angel, Veronis, Baboon, Nathan, and Fast Like a Tortoise. I'm Eric, and hope to see you all again for next month's DM Roundtable discussion.
Good night.